On July 6, 1947, the production of a new firearm began at the Soviet Union's Iveshk machine-building plant, and while production difficulties meant that there wouldn't be an actual gun produced until the following year, the name of the new firearm, which had previously been called the KBP-580, would be derived from the year in which production began, as well as its primary purpose and its primary designer. It was called the Automat Kalashnikov Model 1947, or Automatic Kalashnikov 1947, or more popularly known as the AK-47. And over time, a greater number of this particular weapon and its derivatives would be built than any other firearms platform in history. For good or for ill, the AK-47 can be said to be the world's most popular gun. And yet the design of this weapon is grounded in myth and mystery. And the truth might surprise you. It's history that deserves to be remembered. Victor David Hansen is a senior fellow in classics and military history at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Writing in a 2011 edition of the journal The New Atlantis, Hansen notes that firearms development has traditionally been limited by trade-offs. A more lethal musket, for example, would usually also be heavier and thus less mobile, more expensive, and often less reliable. Trade-offs continued into the age of the machine gun. Early machine guns ruled the battlefields, but were also heavy and often jammed. The first attempts at making a lighter, personal version, the submachine gun, proved effective, but their smaller caliber and the heavy recoil from their rapid firing meant that their range was limited. Submachine guns were also prone to jamming and fired so quickly that soldiers couldn't carry sufficient ammunition. Simply put, the trade-offs involved meant that at the time of the Second World War, machine guns had not completely replaced repeating rifles. Some designs, such as the Browning automatic rifle, patented in 1917, found some success in producing a weapon that offered the advantages of both machine gun and rifle, but the BAR was heavy and its magazine was small. The compromise that would change warfare began with the Wehrmacht. The Sturmgewehr 44, or STG-44, sometimes also called the MP or machine pistol 44, used an intermediate cartridge, more powerful than a pistol but less than a rifle. In this case, a 7.92 by 33 millimeter cartridge, as opposed to the 7.92 by 57 millimeter used by the standard issue German Mauser rifle. With a mass of just over 11 pounds loaded and 37 inches long, it was less bulky than a repeating rifle. It was capable of much greater rate of fire, as much as 600 rounds a minute. Notably, the STG-44 had a selector switch that allowed the soldier to choose between semi-automatic and automatic fire. While it did not match the effective range of a rifle, the weapon was effective to a few hundred yards, the range at which most engagements actually occurred, and well outranged a typical submachine gun. Some 425,000 were produced, and the weapon has seen use even up to the present day. But while the STG-44 would begin the era of the assault rifle, it would be far from the most popular version. The story of the AK-47, or at least the popular version of the story, actually predates the 1943 introduction of the STG-44. Mikhail Kalashnikov was not trained as a gunsmith. Rather, he was conscripted into the Red Army in 1938 and, owing to mechanical skill, sent into the Tank Corps as a mechanic. By 1941, he was a sergeant in command of a 234 tank of the 24th Tank Regiment. His tank was destroyed during the October 1941 Battle of Bryansk, a battle that went badly for the Red Army. Severely wounded, by some accounts nearly killed, he spent months recuperating. By his own account, it was during that period that he heard his fellow soldiers complaining about the quality of the Red Army's rifles, as well as the limited availability of machine guns. Filled with patriotic zeal, the mechanically oriented sergeant began to formulate the idea for what would become the AK-47. Kalashnikov was himself something of a surprise. Born in 1919, his family had been peasants, the landholding class called kulaks, who the Bolsheviks decided had to be eliminated and their lands confiscated for collectivization. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 2 million kulaks were evicted from their land and forcibly relocated. Among those was the family of Mikhail Kalashnikov. If it seems odd that this victim of the Soviet system would become a Soviet hero, his background is maybe even more surprising. As a youth, Kalashnikov not only did not study gunsmithing, he dreamed of something very different. He wrote, "I wrote poetry in my youth, and people thought that I would become a poet." It is a strange story. A sergeant with no training in arms design, a poet and victim of the violent excesses of the revolution, would design a weapon that would change the world and would be touted as a hero of the Russian Federation, whose name cosmonaut Maxim Suroyev said in a message from the International Space Station commemorating Kalashnikov's 90th birthday, became a symbol of our country in the 20th century. C.J. Chivers, a journalist who in 2010 wrote a book about the AK-47, said in a 2017 edition of History Hit, "In the popular imagination, an unlettered sergeant of peasant stock, Mikhail Kalashnikov, conjured the AK-47 to form in an epiphany, born of his innate genius and patriotic devotion." It is a compelling story of the development of the world's most produced firearm, but according to Chivers, a false one. He continues, "The claim that the weapon sprang from the mind of a sergeant was a cheerful Communist Party parable, created for the proletariat through extensive redaction and lies. Rather than the work of a single man, the development of the Soviet assault rifle was a far more complex process." Journalist Olga Savda gave a much more nuanced description of events in a 2003 edition of the newspaper Pravda, writing the true story of the machine gun and Mikhail Kalashnikov's role is not described anywhere. This admission is interesting in that Pravda is a legacy of and still represents the Russian Communist Party, the party that Chivers accuses of creating the Kalashnikov myth. Savda explains that the AK was the product not of the single inspiration of Kalashnikov, but of, quote, "a lot of talented Soviet firearms designers." Maybe more than Kalashnikov, she credits a Soviet military engineer named Vasily Luty. The story, she claims, starts not with the Battle of Bryansk, but nearly 2 years later in July of 1943, when a captured STG-44 was demonstrated at a meeting of the Red Army Arms Committee. Quickly thereafter, 2 other Soviet engineers, Nikolai Lazarov and Pavel Ryazanov, created an interim cartridge of 7.62 by 39 millimeters based on Soviet arms. At the time, Kalashnikov had, owing to his obvious mechanical skill, been moved to the Central Scientific Developmental Firing Range for rifle firearms. He had, from his hospital bed, designed a submachine gun that, while not accepted into the Soviet military, showed his promise in gun design. Here there is a twist of fate. An initial design for a Soviet weapon to fire the intermediate round came from one of the Red Army's most promising weapons designers, Alexei Sudyev. Well, Sudyev's original design, the AS-44 automatic Sudyev model 1944, was promising. It needed revision. But almost certainly Sudyev's design would have been the Soviet assault rifle, and the name Kalashnikov largely unknown, except that Sudyev fell ill in 1945, passing away in 1946 of a gastric ulcer. The AK-47 was as much, it seems, the result of that illness as it was the unique inspiration of Mikhail Kalashnikov. With Sudyev gone, the Soviet Design Bureau decided to hold a contest. Chivers notes that Stalin liked design contests. Kalashnikov was allowed to participate in the contest, despite never having designed a gun that had been accepted into the Soviet military. Kalashnikov's initial design was deemed imperfect, and it would have been consigned to the scrap heap were it not for Luty. As the chief of the department testing the weapon, Major Luty, Safka argues, literally changed the testing conclusion. Kalashnikov's design was totally reworked, a process that included significant controversy. Luty would later take a great degree of credit, along with Vladimir Daikin, another member of the testing department. Safka argues that the gun should have been called the not AK, but LDK, Luty Daikin Kalashnikov. Chivers mentions it's another engineer, Sasha Zaitsev. Kalashnikov referred to Zaitsev as merely having assisted him, but that might have misrepresented his role. Zaikin himself would later take credit for the redesigns. "I suggested the Kalashnikov assault rifle be entirely redesigned," Zaitsev wrote. "I managed to convince him I was right." The issue was more than just who was responsible for the design, but how it was chosen. Luty and Daikin were in charge of the test. Safka quotes scientist Dmitry Shirayev. "Chiefs are supposed to be on a neutral side, according to their status, but they interfered in the matter." Even then, it looked like Kalashnikov's design was not going to be chosen, and the design, the TKB-415 by designer Alexei Alexeyevich Bulkin, would be chosen. Chivers notes that some have accused Kalashnikov of stealing key parts of his design from Bulkin. The issue, Safka writes, was not design, but personality. Bulkin, she writes, had a very malicious temper and worked poorly with the military officers. Sergeant Kalashnikov, on the other hand, was a lot more agreeable, meaning, essentially, willing to deter to people of higher rank. Kalashnikov, in his youth a victim of the Soviet system, simply worked better within it. Perhaps being a poet is what won out in the end. In fact, that might explain why the role of Lyuty was removed from the final story. Lyuty was purged by Stalin in 1951 and dismissed. He would later be rehabilitated after Stalin's death, but by then the Kalashnikov legend was established. You might disagree with what some may say is an attempt to besmirch the name of a firearms legend, but certainly Lyuty and Zykin had their issue with how credit was taken. Before his death in 1990, Lyuty said, Kalashnikov hardly ever mentioned any of his instructors in his interviews and in his book. Only he knows the reason why. Chivers insists that a close reading of available Russian records supports his claim that the Kalashnikov story is more convenient Soviet myth than design reality. But as designs go, there's a more fundamental question. The AK-47 was created in response to the STG-44 and outwardly greatly resembles the progenitor of the assault rifle. Did Kalashnikov and others steal the design from the Germans? Certainly the ergonomics of the STG-44 influenced the AK design, as did the general idea of an intermediate round and the ability to select semi-automatic or automatic fire. But the STG uses a different operating system, and actually there is an interesting twist. While the STG-44 uses a tilting bolt, the AK uses a long-stroke gas piston and rotating bolt. The important point, the AK design is nearly identical to the M1 Garand, the primary rifle used by the U.S. in the Second World War and beyond. In fact, the AK design has been described as a simplified M1 system that has been flipped upside down. That is to say that the system that makes the AK is actually derived from an American weapon, or more properly a Canadian-American weapon, in that John Garand was born in Canada. That, of course, represents an irony, as the two allies in the Second World War were Cold War adversaries, something that was already obvious when the AK went into production in 1947. Beyond the question of who and how, there's also the question of the weapon itself. Is the most produced firearm in history truly uniquely great? Again, Chivers disagrees. Certainly you can get a robust discussion of the AK-47 versus the U.S. M16 or even the STG-44. The AK-47 is often said to excel in reliability under even difficult circumstances. This is generally credited to intentionally loose tolerances. That is, the weapon is designed to be deliberately imprecise. As opposed to precision weapons with precise tolerances, the AK-47 is less likely to be fouled by dirt, sand, and carbon, as its long-stroke gas system allows the heavy bolt to crush such debris. This is the result of the simplicity of the design. Kalashnikov himself famously said that it is 1,000 times harder to make simple things than complicated ones. But is it uniquely good? Chivers notes to NPR that the short-barrel design is inaccurate. Notwithstanding the legends that it is a ferocious machine, a killing tool at longer ranges, it's actually not especially effective. At shorter ranges, it's a terrible weapon, but at longer ranges, which is pretty common for the ambushes in the arid places such as Afghanistan and Iraq where there's not a lot of vegetation, they often missed. That is, against a traditional foe like the U.S., the AK-47 might be at a disadvantage. It is more valuable, he argues, because of how they work against a larger set of victims, how they work against civilians, how they work at checkpoints, how they work in the commission of crimes, and for all these things, it is a terrible weapon. That might go a long way towards why the weapon is so ubiquitous. It is simple to manufacture, simple to maintain, and easily used by even troops with minimal training. And in a world where the targets are often more civilian than military, it is, as Chivers says, a terrible weapon. But perhaps more important, Chivers argues that the Soviets made the production and distribution of the AK-47 a central part of their strategy for courting Cold War allies. That is, it might not have been the unique quality of the weapon, as much as it was the Soviet strategy of giving lots of them to their friends, that made it the world's most common firearm. To be fair, Mikhail Kalashnikov passed away in 2013 and isn't here to defend his reputation against those who claim that someone else should receive a greater degree of credit for the weapon that today bears his name, but it certainly seems that the design of the AK-47 was a much more complex process than the popular myth implies. The AK-47 has been produced in such numbers that it can be said to have fundamentally altered the world's power and politics, with an estimated 100 million produced and the vast majority of those still in use. And while the story of its design might be grounded in myth, the story of its impact on history is written in blood. Most military historians agree that the AK-47 has killed more people than any other firearm. In fact, some argue that the AK-47 is the most lethal single weapon in history. And as to that terrible weapon and its reputation, often associated with repressive regimes and terrorists, Kalashnikov merely shrugged and said, "I sleep well. It is the politicians who are to blame for failing to come to an agreement and resorting to violence." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.